Hello out there and welcome to Answers for Today. My name's Bill Wynn and I'm here in studio with Pastor Terry Reynolds from Agape Chapel in Orange County and with Chris Quintana from Old Path in Cypress, California. He just changed the name of his church, so I have to always think and make sure I don't monkey it up too bad. So last week we talked about rejoicing and about how this is the season to rejoice. And boy, we've had a couple people that got back to us and said, you know, it's kind of hard to rejoice when everything is all messed up and, you know, things are upside down. I've got family issues. I'm discouraged about, you know, what's going on with my kids. I'm discouraged about what's on the news. I'm discouraged about all the things that are going on in a country that can't seem to find its way. Well, we're here to tell you that we know what the way is for the country to find, and that there's some reasons for that sort of, I guess, discourse that's going on out there, disunity, if you want to call it that. And so we want to talk today a little bit about what causes these things back and forth between people, disagreements and confusion. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Tara.
You know, guys, I make the mistake, I guess, in a sense, but, you know, like anybody, you drive a lot, and I turn on, Hannity, or I turn on Rush Limbaugh, and get home, and if I'm in some place here, CSN, and you listen to this stuff, and it's just so discouraging, you know, just not only what's going on in the politics, but the sexual scandal that's hitting, not only from school teachers to Hollywood, to clergy people, to the politicians. It's almost like you're getting hit with waves where takes your joy right away. And we were talking at the end of last week's program, Chris, about where does problems come from? Did James talk to us about that?
Yeah, that's how chapter 4 begins. We were talking about before the show, Bill and I. And chapter 4 tells you exactly what it is. I think he's turning to it so he can go ahead and read it. But we began the last time that we were together, we talked about having an understanding of the things that are temporal. That's where all of our frustration comes from. So if our rejoicing is to come from somewhere else, it's to consider what is future.
Yes.
So this world is, it's filled with discouragement. That's what the world's built on. That's why we're told, whether we're reading in Romans or even what James has to say in chapter 4, we're to have as much of a detachment from the carnal, worldly, earthly things as we can possibly have. Or using Jesus' words in chapter 17, they're in the world, but they're not of the world. So that it sounds like some neat philosophical thing, but there's a truth behind that. Yeah, we have to live in this very physical world, absolutely. But given that we've been born again and have a spiritual rebirth, and now our focus is on what is to come, and our expectation and hope is about future.
Yes.
When we see God face to face, it makes the day-to-day nonsense palatable somewhat, because we say it's just for a time.
Yeah.
This is for a time, and then we will see him face to face. And I've been saying this at church recently, and it's just something that's really on my mind. None of us have ever seen Jesus face to face.
No.
But that day's coming.
That's
When we
beautiful.
but when we see him face to face, that will never not be the reality. We will always, from that moment on, behold his face eternally. We'll be right where he is. So that understanding, that's 1 John chapter 3 tells us that. We don't know what we're going to be, but this we know. When we see him face to face, we'll be like him, for we'll see him as he is. Okay, great. And it says, anybody who has that hope in him purifies himself. Great.
You know, Bill, why don't you go ahead and read James chapter 4, verse 1 to the audience? And so
It says, what is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure.
whoa, does that talk? Isn't that exactly where we're at in our society, Bill? Or you just
Yeah, absolutely. It goes on. Let me just read a little bit further. You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God. What do you think the scriptures mean when they say that the Spirit of God is placed within us is filled with envy? But he gives us even more grace to stand against such evil desires, as the scriptures say. God opposes the proud, but favors the humble.
Can I point out something?
Yeah, I was hoping you could jump in and just share.
If I could. What you've just read from James is the first of the epistles written to the church. It's a general epistle. It's not written to any particular group. It's just to those dispersed throughout.
Just every believer.
Yep. And so those are the people that got out of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas because of the persecution. They're scattered abroad, is what James says. So when he says that to them, it is about, hey, conduct yourself in the world and realize that if you've got a friendship with the world, you're now an enemy of God and vice versa. Okay, that's at the beginning of the church. First thing that's written in the way of epistle by James to the whosoevers. Much later in church history, towards the close of Paul's ministry, notice this parallel. We've already heard what you've said. Look at what Paul says in Romans 8, where we were the last time we were together.
Turn your Bible to Romans 8, where we're going to be at. Okay. Go
Listen to these two side by side. Verse 5, remembering what we just read from James, verse 5 of chapter 8, for those who live according to the flesh or worldly set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. Now, why would that be? Verse 6 tells us, because to live carnally or earthly or sensually, to have that mind is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Now, why is that? Well, because the carnal mind, the earthly, unsaved mind, is at war with God. Enmity is the word that's used there. For it is not subject to the law of God, nor could it be. Wow. So verse 8. So then, here's your conclusion. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Is that not exactly what James said?
Yep.
So notice that there is an absolute continuity of thought from the first of the epistles to one of the last by a completely different author telling you the same truth.
Well, let's go back a little bit farther to the words of Jesus when he was sharing the parable of the sower. He says the cares of this world will choke off the word or choke off the effectiveness of God. And so as the guys were sharing with you out of James and out of Romans, and you might say, you know what, I'm not feeling much joy today. Maybe the cares of this world is choking off your joy, and you lost sight of the eternal values of your life, and maybe it's time to come back home. I will like to introduce to you a guy named Malachi. He's the last book of the Bible. And in that book, he said, they asked him, how should a man rob God? How should, and he was dealing with his tithes and the offerings, and they weren't giving their lives completely wholly over to the Lord. And the Lord just simply said to Malachi, really, the prophet spoke. He was challenging them. And he says, if you return unto me, says the Lord, I will return unto you. See, they had lost their way. And as James wrote, he says the dangers of the early church was returning back to the world. And then Paul's writing in here, like Chris said, years later, he's stating the fact, as he's seeing so many churches and so many believers, the reason why you're having so much trouble is you're carnally minded, he says. And I love it. He says in the end of verse 6, maybe you can pick up on this, guys. He says, for to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. There isn't a go-between, there isn't. Either you're one or the other, right?
Right.
Bill, why don't you
Right,
kind of share?
and he says, and remember that those who do not have the Spirit of Christ living in them do not belong to Him at all.
Yes.
And like you say, it's a binary situation. It's either one way or the other. Either you have and know who Jesus Christ is, and therefore you have the Spirit living within you, or you don't. And it's a decision that we have to make, and God did that for a reason. Because if it was a requirement of us, in other words, if it was forced on us that we all could make that decision, that we didn't have free will to go one way or the other, then it wouldn't demonstrate to God how much we love him. We would just be a bunch of robots out there that would just be doing what God had originally told us to do. So because God set it up this way, we have free will and we have a decision to make. And, it's the most important decision you'll ever make, even beyond who you marry, I think, is, what do you do with Jesus Christ? Who is he?
So far with last program, we were looking in Romans chapter 8. We find out we're not condemned. Now he tells us if we seek Christ, we're going to experience life and peace. Those are, I'd call all victories for us, right, Chris?
Right.
And how do people have this peace of God and the life of God that I think that all of us are looking for, because the life at the end of the bottle is empty. The life of trying to live for yourself and a career is empty. But here Paul is saying is you can have life and you can have peace within your life. And he really lays it out here for us. Paul does. Chris, why don't you share a little bit?
I'd love to. You read something from Malachi, which I just thought, I love it. I'm so glad you brought that up. If we read Malachi chapter 1, we're doing this.
Yeah.
Let's broaden our understanding of this. Remember a little bit about Malachi. For the people who have kind of an understanding of the Old Testament, the prophets were speaking to the nation, and there was trouble coming.
Yes.
When he spoke through Isaiah and other of the minor prophets to the northern tribes, hey guys, get it together or else, they didn't get it together, in comes the Assyrians and they're taken out. Yeah. Later, the areas around Jerusalem were being warned of very much the same kind of things.
Is this the time of Malachi then?
This is after. So when you look at those things, the warning was, okay, Judah, Jerusalem, the tribes that are left, get it together or else it's not the Assyrians, it's going to be the Babylonians.
Yeah.
And he tells them they're not going to get it together. He tells them that they're going to go away, even for how long. Ezra and Nehemiah, they're known to us from their books. They come back as God restores them in the land. It's about a generation and a half later that Malachi has written what you talked about. Chapter 1 is that the priesthood had become so corrupt that they were offering the sick and the diseased and the lame and putting it up on the altar and offering it to God.
Wow.
He indicts their hearts in chapter 1 and says, offer that to your governor, your secular government. Give them that offering, and yet you'll bring that to me?
Yeah.
So when we fast forward to what Paul is trying to get across to us, there is to be a separation in us. At times of the Old Testament, they were going to bring an offering of an animal and everything else. Paul tells us in Romans 12, I beseech you, this is of your free will, offer yourselves as living sacrifices.
Wow.
We don't make sacrifices like those in Malachi, but what's the quality of the offering is still the same as it was to them. When we come to God and we say, here, I offer you myself. Well, what kind of an offering is it? Lame, sick, diseased, blind? Or is it the best of the best of the best? And he says, present yourself in that way, and it's up to you. So when we stop to realize why should we care about that, look at what he ends up saying to us and helping us to realize if you're going to offer something that's diseased, it's because it's so infested with the worldly things. And God calls us to a place of separation, spiritually speaking, though we're very much in this world and we're supposed to be the reason why we can give people an alternative. Our lives are to show that based upon a spiritual truth. I'll offer myself to God, and what he can use me for in this world is to say, I'll take this, what you've offered. You've presented yourself. I'll send you into the world as something that is totally different, and you have a message.
So Bill, I guess what we can gather then from Malachi, Romans, and James is we have a responsibility. God has done his part by sending his son. In fact, he goes on, so they that are in the flesh cannot please God, and you are not in the flesh, but are in the spirit, and be in the spirit of God dwell in you. If any man have not the spirit of Christ, he is none of this. And if Christ be in you, then the body is dead as sin, but the spirit is life because of righteousness. So he keeps on talking about there's a difference between the two. As you go through Romans, as you go through, but we have a responsibility, don't we?
Yes.
And could you tell the audience what is that responsibility according to what we see in the scriptures here?
Well, to me, one has to become a little bit knowledgeable. There's many people, I think, out there that say, well, Christianity is not for me. But they haven't done their research, and they haven't become a little bit knowledgeable. And I think that it's important that what you do is with an open mind, and I'm certainly, I think all of us, we're all willing to let you compare Christianity to any other faith out there. Go ahead and do it. We welcome the chance to discuss that with somebody, because the fact of the matter is that historically, archaeologically, the obvious nature of man, the result of the nature of man in history, all of the facts, including the manuscripts and the history books and everything else, bring to bear the truth that comes from the Christian Bible. And so we are required to do a certain level of homework so that we're knowledgeable. And once that we have that knowledge, we're asked the question, who is Jesus? And what God has done, the creator of the universe, has put together a plan where the fulcrum or the pivot point of where we end up in life, whether it's life and peace or frustration and sadness, and confusion, it relates to how we answer that question. Who is Jesus? Because that's who God sent. And when you look at it in the whole arc of history and the evidence of what mankind has treated himself, treated other men and women, and you look at it, you know that man has a fallen nature and he needs a redeemer. And Christianity is the only faith that provides for that redeemer through Jesus Christ. And so we're called on to make that decision. We have to make a decision one way or the other. Not becoming educated and just saying it's not for me, that's making a decision.
That's the key. We could wallow in our sins, wallow in our despair, or else we can make a choice, Chris. And I love it where he says, but you are not in the flesh.
Right.
Paul's making a very emphatic statement as a Christian that we need to be identifying with the Spirit. I want you to share a little bit about these verses here that we just looked at. And let me read one more verse, and then I'm going to have Chris share it with you. He says, but if the Spirit of him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he that raised Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal bodies by the Spirit that dwells in you. And so he's making some very powerful statements for us to understand.
As I'm listening to what we're talking about and reading the text, I know how the devil loves to twist this, because there's probably somebody watching this, maybe a lot of them, that are saying, that's easy for you guys sitting around a table, you've got it all figured out, and so do all those people in the Bible, but I have nothing but struggle in my life.
Yes.
And yet they're believers and everything else. Well, let me just make sure, I'll say it for all of us, and we can all say this. We are not the people that we were when we first got saved.
No.
God has made up a lot of ground.
Yes.
So I always want to be careful to recognize and say, there is no single Christian, whether it's Paul or anyone else, that would ever be able to say, I've got it all figured out, I'm finally perfect. Because remember, this is the same Paul that said, oh, wretched man that I am.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he wasn't perfect. He hadn't attained. It was a source of frustration to him too. So I want everybody to realize that there's no perfect Christian, but goodness, we should be able to look back and I could say, but I am certainly not the person that I was when I first got saved.
Mm-hmm.
God has done amazing, great things. Remember that what we read here is the ideal. If we could be in this place, praise the Lord. We're going to struggle because the devil's really good about trying to introduce discouragement to us. That happens all the time. It is, again, if we can live in that idea of saying, yeah, this is what it is. This world is based upon confusion. It is based upon disappointment and discouragement and all the rest. The less I focus on this life and focus on the one that is to come, that is secure and perfect in Jesus, helps me to come to grips with how does this become reality. These are statements of fact. Now, whether we're going to accept them and live in them is completely up to us. If we want to do the Eeyore thing and look at how awful our life is, okay, great. That's an easy thing to do. That's human nature. But I can go ahead and say, I jokingly will say this to people at church. Look, if the devil wanted to go ahead and put out a whole notebook of all of my failures, I'd be able to tell him, well, you left some stuff out if I'm going to be honest with the whole thing. So I could go ahead and add to his list because I've done plenty of other things too. But Jesus died to forgive me of those things and to cleanse that stuff out of my life. I'm not going to focus on the failure.
Yes. You know, the beautiful thing is that when you look at our lives as Christians, and Paul looked at it, guys, too, in his own life, he wrote later on, this is that we are his workmanship. We're his poemas, that beautiful word in the Greek language. It's, you know, a guy that's basically like our life on a potter's wheel, where God's molded us, God's changing us, and that's where the great grace of God falls in, Bill. Where even though, you know, I struggle with the law within me, my own failures, the beauty is that I know that I'm not going to be the same man a year from now that I am today, because Christ is changing me day by day by day. Talk again about to them. I feel that there's people that are watching and are just feeling weighted down by sin, and they want to know that God's not sitting there pointing a finger and saying, you didn't do this and you didn't do that. Share with them.
Well, and I think it's important to know that the same Spirit, as he says here in Romans 8 in verse 11, he says the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead,
That's pretty powerful, right?
okay, lives in you.
Wow.
You know, so it's not like this is just a little tickle or something, you know, that you should get all excited about it. This is the power unto life.
The most powerful source that's ever been
Right.
is the power that raised Jesus from the dead.
Exactly. So this is the power of life.
And
God giving
lives,
life.
lives in those who are listening to it right now.
Lives in you. And then it says, but if through the power of the Spirit, now the Spirit of life who lives in you, you put to death the deeds of your sinful nature, you will live. Wow. And so what we're asked to do is to just let God's Spirit deal with our flesh and to put away those things of sin and things that we don't want to do that we do anyway. And you let God deal with it, and that Spirit will take over and will, in fact, put those things as far as the east is from the west. And so, what a incredible process to rejoice about.
Yeah.
Because it isn't about what we do; it's about what God will do in us and through us. And so, it's something that this time of year we have to realize that God can overcome all the things that we're facing, and he can get us through any trial. I mean, for heaven's sakes, he opened up the Red Sea. He, you know, brought manna out of the sky. I mean, he can do all these things, and all we need to do is just ask him to deal with the things that are not of him, that are a part of what we're doing day to day. And it's just really an exciting thing when you start to live a life in the Spirit where you know that God is in control and you're not, and that all you have to do is follow what it is that he's telling you to do. And that his power, that power that raised Jesus from the dead, is within you.
You know, Bill, there was once a story where somebody came to Jesus and Jesus told him only believe. His response to the Lord said, Lord, I believe, but help me with my unbelief. And I think a lot of us find ourselves in there. And like you said, as Jesus encouraged him to believe in the power of God that's in you to transform you, to help you along. I think it's far more than we could ever really conceive in our mind that he wants to do. And then, like he mentioned, verse 13, Chris, he says, for if, again, you live after the flesh, you should die. But if you through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, you should live. And so a decision making again there. Mortify, a big word. Why don't you help us with the understanding?
It's again putting to death. The problem that, well, boy, talk about the culture of the church in America. We've made church into something. If you join it, you get some kind of really cool perk package of this, that, and the other thing.
A discount in the bookstore.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really, everything's right there at your fingertips because God's some kind of a vending machine that you just pull the knob and get what you want. So we've made him into that, and yet we've already talked about James, and James is the one that says, consider it all joy when you fall into various trials and things like that. So what's implied in that is that Christianity's not the easy life. How do we know that? Look at these guys; they died for it.
Yeah.
So what we've perverted it in the church modern day to somehow think that just joining a church is going to make your life easy. Forget that. That's nonsense. James said, "Consider it all joy." Well, that implies that there are trouble, but he says because the testing of your faith it'll provide or it'll lead to patience.
Guys, we can't believe we only got a few minutes left, but I want to share another wonderful, encouraging word that Paul gives us. He says in verse 14, "For as many as led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God." You belong to the family of God. Bill, it's a beautiful thing to belong to the family of God. We're going to talk on future programs and more about Romans 8. Not only we're the children of God, we're heirs with him. We're no longer condemned. We've been set free. Well, it just goes on and on, this chapter that we have, because Jesus, like you were saying earlier, Jesus has set us free and he lives within us. Once you share, you got a minute or so.
Well, I think it's even more cool that he says you're the children or the sons of God. And when you think about this time of year, I know in our house, it's about the kids. Man,
Yes.
It's about the kids. And God has exactly the same feeling in his heart about us as we do about our kids. And he wants to bless us just as much as we want to bless our kids. And so at this time of year, you just need to recognize that the creator of the universe wants to bless you.
Yeah.
And this is the time of year when he blessed you for all eternity by providing a pathway through his son, Jesus Christ, to be reconciled to him. What better of a gift could you have than to have the ability to enter into God's throne room and ask him, to petition him for what it is that we need? So it's something for us to be really rejoiceful about. Now, there's a new word for you, rejoiceful.
Chris, you got about 30 seconds. Any final thought for the audience?
Jumping on that, we see in Isaiah chapter 9 that unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. So you'll see it on the Christmas cards. Remember that what's being said. That means that there is a father to whom a child was born, happens to be the Son of God. We will give account for what we did with that gift.
God sent his son. That's the story. That's the hope for the day. And again, I pray that you might turn your life over to Jesus. And on behalf of Chris and Bill, this is Terry. May God richly bless you.
For information about this broadcast, or if you have any questions, feel free to mail us at Agape Chapel OC, P.O. Box 4023, Huntington Beach, California, 92647.